Hello and welcome to our continuing COVID-19 webinar series. Since coronavirus broke all the way back in the second week of March, it almost feels like years ago, not weeks ago, we've been running our COVID-19 webinar series to support accountants. Accountants are the front line in terms of business and protecting livelihoods. And we want to help you do your work and make it easier for you. That's the purpose of our webinar series. We've looked at everything from HR, subsidy schemes, we've looked at audit, we've looked at financial reporting, we've looked at practical business advice, your business, we've looked at how you protect and develop your business. And what we're looking at today is GDPR. Now, just the background to today's session, before coronavirus ever came, there was an issue in relation to data protection. And the new GDPR regulations landed in May 2018. The accountancy profession adopted and moved. But our experience, even before coronavirus, was there was very varying levels of compliance and varying levels of appropriate procedures in place. This has been massively exacerbated by what has gone on in the last 6 weeks with firms, more and more firms moving to remote working environments. Some firms were set up and ready to move to remote working, whereas other firms, this was foisted on them. As the closures, as the shutdowns came, people had to move from physical office environments to remote office working. And we have grave concerns about GDPR compliance in that environment. Now, we're looking at the issues as they arise, and we feel now is the appropriate time to introduce GDPR. We're fully aware that accountants are on the front line. They're on the front line, serving their clients, serving their customers, fighting for business and fighting for the economy. You need to think about GDPR. You need to think about realistically, where are you and what do you need to do? We are joined today by Richard Jackson, and Richard is going to introduce himself. And in this webinar, we're going to go through 5 topics that we believe are fundamental for the accountancy profession to consider right now. This is a 60-minute webinar. So wherever you're joining us, whether you're live on the webinar with us, or whether you're joining through Facebook, through LinkedIn, through YouTube, wherever you are joining, if you have any questions during this session, put them in the comments box below, or if you're on the Zoom webinar, either in the chat box and the Q&A box. We're expecting a big audience today, so we may not get to answer every question, but any questions that you have, put them in down below, and the team will feed them in here to Richard and myself. The slides for today's session, so the slides and material for today's session, they are available in the comment box below or in the chat box below. You will be able to download the slides. So JR has just put a link into the chat box there now, where you can download the slides. We have established a UK specific accountants Facebook group. So the UK specific accountants Facebook group, this is where we're going to put all of our COVID resources and all of our COVID material. So if you're an Irish accountant, you've seen the links to our Irish Facebook group, but JR has also, for UK accountants, put a link to the UK Facebook group. So Richard, can you just introduce yourself, give a little bit of background and explain to people why they should listen to you today?
Thanks, Des. Yeah, so my name's Richard Jackson. I run an organisation called Pulse Cybersecurity in the UK. So my background, I'm an EU certified GDPR practitioner with expertise and qualifications in cybersecurity as well. So the two are very closely aligned, obviously. But I also have a background in working with accountants and also going right back into manufacturing. So I've got a wide skill set. I understand that the GDPR and cybersecurity are not at the top of everyone's list in terms of how they spend their day. They just want to focus on running their business. but as you've alluded to, it's key to every element of their business, and it should be as part of their culture and their DNA. So we're going to cover a lot today, far too much to cover in an hour really, but hopefully we'll touch on everything that's relevant, and we'll come up with some meaningful data and statistics that will relate to people immediately.
Richard, before we get into the material, and I know it's impossible to ignore the coronavirus issues.
Yeah.
But if we were running this webinar in January, what are you seeing are the practical problems in terms of the accountancy profession? And straight out of the traps, what are the issues that would concern you for an accountant, excluding the new coronavirus issues?
Yeah. So two really is the perfect storm of the fact that accountants process high value data they rely on reputation, and the fact that generally data security standards across the UK and Ireland are consistently low. And the focus has been from the outset, going back to May 2018, was on ticking boxes as opposed to embedding the GDPR and cybersecurity through your business culture, so that you've got a really strong human firewall, which is something we'll talk about today. And that's all about educating your people. And there's huge evidence and consistent evidence that suggests it's your employees that represent the greatest risk to accountants. So that's where they need to focus their attention. And that's, as you said, even before the fact that the accountants had to very quickly send their employees to home work, the risk was already quite high. That's just accelerated that risk off the chart. People are working at home in very insecure home working environments. So yeah, it's a real red flag at the moment for the industry.
I'm not a GDPR expert or a cybersecurity expert like yourself, Richard, but I genuinely do think that there's a little bit of gap in the appreciation of the amount of valuable data that accountants process.
Yeah.
Like a breach of a security breach or an information breach, hackers, accountants have basically all in the one big bucket on their server somewhere. They have huge amounts of information for identity theft, fraud, it's massive. I don't think accountants quite, GDPR comes in and it's okay. Yeah, GDPR is there. It's one of those things.
Yeah.
But it's not like frontline as important as preparing for your monitoring visit or tax compliance. It kind of comes down the list of priorities, but from a data perspective, it's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a little bit like health and safety. We've talked before, you and I, about the fact that the health and safety culture that maybe didn't exist until the last sort of 20 years. And just because a set of legislation comes in, it doesn't mean that immediately organizations adopt that into their culture. And it's going to take time. But as you said, business gets in the way of data security. But I know, for instance, in the UK, the culture of health and safety is very strong, to the point where it's almost the first thought before you carry out an act. That needs to be how it becomes with cybersecurity and the GDPR. And also not just the fact that accountants are processing data, they've also got third parties processing data on their behalf, using practice management software. And I'll give an example later on of one that everyone will know very well that had a data breach last year in the US, and had that happened within the European environment, would have resulted in a significant fine. So
you talk about the culture of health and safety. I had a conversation with somebody recently, Richard, and they were talking about seat belts and child seats in cars.
Yeah.
Now, I know I look a little bit older and I'm a little bit short of hair on top, but I'm actually only 44. But I remember as a kid in the 80s, like, we didn't have seatbelts. I don't even think there was seatbelts in the back of one of our cars. And by the end of the 80s, seatbelts became compulsory. And now you look at, like, we've got 3 kids and they've all got different types of car seats. But it's that cultural shift. What was acceptable in the 90s, what was acceptable in the 2000s, as we come into 2020, culturally, we're moving here.
Yeah. I think part of the cultural shift will come with the increased penalties from the Data Commission in Ireland and the ICO in the UK, and we'll see some stats that will pop up in a while about how other countries are fining on a regular basis. And I imagine that the regular fining culture is having an impact on how seriously people take the subject. So unfortunately, you sometimes do need the big bad wolf just to bring it sharply into focus that you genuinely do have to look after the data you process, and there are implications if you don't, because at the moment it's very difficult in the UK and Ireland to be sat in my seat to talk about the importance of GDPR compliance and looking after data when there are no obvious implications, although we're starting to see that in the UK in the last few months with the intent to flex those muscles. I do think that obviously it would be a PR disaster for both commissions to go out of their way to fine organisations at the moment when they're struggling with the impact of COVID-19. So I think that when we get into maybe the autumn or into the early part of 2021, we'll see both supervising authorities starting to get quite aggressive with their fining.
Okay, so Richard, maybe if you want to bring up your slides and explain to us, what are we going to cover? But there's a great question in here straight away, and the question comes in from Joe. What are the basic GDPR requirements to have for a monitoring visit? And Joe, it's a great question, but I think that is one of the big differences. I think one of the big differences is when accountants have a monitoring visit, they've got to get their money laundering right. They've got to get their audit files right. They've got to do compliance, and they're checked every 5 years. So most accountants get the stuff right. GDPR currently doesn't form part of the institute monitoring process at all. It's got nothing to do with your institutes. They have no responsibility for GDPR. Currently, they don't monitor GDPR. So it's the ICO and it's the Data Protection Office who deal with GDPR. So in terms of a monitoring visit, Joe, it just doesn't come up.
No, we see this in the UK with in the health and social care sector, where the Care Quality Commission, for instance, have their own standards around data security. The NHS has its own standards around data security, and the health providers get very hung up on meeting those standards and completely overlook or don't even know that the Information Commissioner's Office is the supervising authority for the GDPR. That's who will issue fines, and that's the body that would ultimately maybe have the power to end their business if it comes to it.
Yeah, and Howard has come in here with another observation, which I fully agree with. The reason for complacency among most small, medium-sized accountants is probably that we believe the legislation was really aimed at Facebook, Twitter, Amazon. And let's be honest here, folks. That is part of the focus, but it's not just Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon. You guys are treated the same as if you were Facebook.
Yeah, any organization of any size, you have the same responsibilities and obligations. It may be that that's a more kind of point of focus in Ireland because you have Google and Amazon residing within Ireland, and the Information Commissioner has a responsibility, direct ownership really of those two massive organizations. But it applies to any organization of any size.
Okay, so you've got 5 topics you're going to look at today, Richard.
Yeah, so 5 topics. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to be very difficult to cover all of them in the depth that maybe people might expect or hope for. So, we could ultimately have more webinars that come out of the back of it. We're going to look back at the first 2 years of the GDPR as it edges towards its 2nd birthday in May. We're going to look at the GDPR and COVID-19 and why we're exposed to the risk even more than ever before. I'm going to talk about the 5 laws of cybersecurity, which are very short and to the point, but hopefully will kind of give people some things to think about before going on to the Human Firewall. And then we'll finish with COVID-19 and cybercrime, what I'm referring to as the other pandemic. It's worth saying at this point that I don't think a few months ago we would have been thinking about having webinars talking about a global pandemic in relation to the GDPR and cybersecurity, Des. I mean, that's it's quite astonishing, really, that we're even having this conversation, but it's pretty pertinent. So,
it's the world we live in.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Okay, so let's just do a bit of an overview so we can compare the UK and Ireland. So, in Ireland, obviously, you've got the Data Protection Commission led by Helen Dixon, who interestingly has a a background in information technology. So in my role as a consultant, that would suggest to me that she's focused on the technical controls that keep an organization or an accountancy practice secure. And the mission statement of the organization is very much focused around compliance, guidance, supervision, and enforcement. And as we see with the UK, that's a little bit different. And as I mentioned, Ireland is the direct regulator for Google and Amazon, which is a huge responsibility for any information commission or supervising authority. Some interesting stats about Ireland and the GDPR. So we're looking at a country that has the second highest data breach reporting rate in Europe at the moment. So nearly 7,000 breaches reported in 2019, up 71% on 2018, and especially relevant to accountants, there's a heavy trend in the financial sector. So there's repeated breaches due to the accidental sharing of data, which is something that we'll talk about as we go forward in terms of the threat actors that exist within your practice. They're generally your employees, most often through accidental acts. Very, very rarely is it malicious, but the impact is the same. And the Commission is generally calling for more staff training, stronger passwords, and multi-factor or two-factor authentication. Going back to the first question you fielded just now, Des, the one issue that the ICO in the UK focuses on quite a lot is that if you were to have a breach and they were to come knocking on the door, the two things they'd be looking for is evidence that you've trained your staff, and they'd like to see evidence of your documentation. So that's something to always keep in mind with the fact that you need to educate your employees. In the UK, we have Elizabeth Denham, a Canadian former Information Commissioner for British Columbia. And the mission statement for the ICO is to uphold information rights for the public in the digital age. So there's no talk of compliance in that sense. It's more about educating people, and the message even early in 2018 was that they were going to try and work with organizations as opposed to wielding the kind of fines that they could wield. But I think the impact of that over 2 years has been, as we touched on, there hasn't been many fines, and that's now maybe leading to some apathy towards the regulations. So let's look at what 2 years has played out like in the last 2 years. So we have to go back to 2011. So the GDPR journey is nearly 10 years old at this point, when the EU was recognizing that it needed to review how data was managed and looked after in Europe, and then was proposing comprehensive reforms. The fact that the regulations across Europe just weren't fit for purpose in the way that we'd started using technology, either in our home lives or in business. And there was massively strong support for the GDPR with 90%, 95% voting in favour of the new regulations. And in 2016, it came into force. So when we got to 2018, and when we first met, there's Accountex, GDPR came into law in the UK that very day. But it wasn't kind of a surprise announcement. It was leading in for 2 years before that, and organisations at this point where we are now have kind of been aware of GDPR for about 4 years. In terms of the landscape, in terms of the fines, 230 fines have been issued across Europe since May 2018. The UK and Ireland combined for just one fine between them, and we're going to talk a bit more about why that might be in a moment. But generally, it's fair to say both supervising authorities have been slow or reluctant to issue penalties. In the UK, one of the reasons for that, I think, is that they've been reporting, the ICO has been reporting over-reporting of breaches. So for every 3 breaches that are reported, only 1 needed to be, but they still then need to investigate, and they still need to go into finding out what had gone on with that breach. But as I said, Ireland is the second highest breach reporter in Europe, so it could be the same thing. It could be that Helen Dixon and her team are dealing with a massive over-reporting trend, and maybe start to catch up in 2021. This is a bit of a snapshot of how the different nation states are fining. And you can very quickly see there's some countries there that stand out, in particular Spain, which is issuing fines on a consistent basis, over 50 fines more than any other nation state. So there's a culture there where they've immediately leapt on the fact that they feel that the fining is something which is going to empower their supervising authority and for the subject of the GDPR to be taken seriously very quickly. And then you've got Germany, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria to some extent, also very heavily fining. And I think what's happening there is that the supervising authorities in each country are very different in how they approach it. Spain even issued a €250,000 fine to La Liga, the primary football league in Spain, for an app that they were using, so that they're not afraid to wield their power and they're not afraid to take on the big boys with their fines. This is a really interesting slide, and this for any accountancy firm that thinks that fines in Ireland or the UK are still going to kind of plateau at a very low trend. There's been nearly 500 million euros of fines issued so far. Interestingly, 64% of those fines have been in the last 6 months. So there's a massive peak from October onwards, when the supervising authorities across Europe started to implement these fines, started to kind of grow into the GDPR, and started to feel the need to wield the power. This tells me that had COVID-19 not developed in the early part of this year, that trend would have continued and maybe would have increased in its escalation. And I think in the UK and Ireland, we would have started seeing some fines this year. I think that would be maybe something we start to see in the autumn. But it definitely looks like the various supervising authorities are starting to wield that power. And in the UK, we saw our first fine in December, mid-December, to Doorstep Dispensary, which is a pharmacy in London. They've got 3 high street premises, but their main business was to deliver prescriptions to residential homes. So they were fined €313,000 and given 4 weeks to pay in full. So no messing around in terms of paying it. It's based on turnover. It doesn't mean that the organisation actually had the money to pay. My interpretation at the time was that the ICO was signalling its intent and needed to maybe focus on key sectors. And I definitely feel that accountancy and finance comes into that target. And I do think, unfortunately, that examples are essential to demonstrate intent. And once we start to see fines on a regular basis, and in Spain, for instance, some of those fines might only be €500, it just shows that the impact will be felt. And I think that the reputational damage of being publicised as having been fined for a breach of the GDPR is far more damaging than any financial penalty. The fact that your accountancy practice couldn't be trusted with managing data or processing data is a huge impact on any organisation. And I think you'd start to see loss of clients on a gradual basis. You'd see a migration of clients to other practices. It might not happen overnight. You wouldn't know it's going on until you start to feel the pain. So that's something to keep in mind.
I see Tom has asked a great question here, Richard, about fines.
Yes.
He's asked a great question about, do the fines go to the exchequer? Now, I suppose, Tom, maybe I'm not right to mind read where your question was going, but obviously the exchequers in the UK and Ireland are now under serious financial pressure. Do the fine, I presume the fines go back into the respective data commissioners' offices, and that will defray their expenses. So indirectly, it does end up in the exchequer. But reading behind, is there a risk that now, when everything is being looked at as a source of funds, that this could be seen as a fundraising activity, and that the clampdown on the fines could become much more frequent in Ireland than the UK?
I don't believe so personally. And you also have to kind of take into account that under the previous Data Protection Act in the UK, that the organisations that were most often fined were public bodies such as police authorities, police forces, the NHS. The NHS, for instance, would be a primary target for ransomware because of the special category data that's processed within health. So being a little bit of a cynic, you could argue that an NHS trust would be the most likely kind of body that would pay ransom rather than admit a data breach. So in some sense, under the new rules of the GDPR, you could effectively fine a government body tens of millions of pounds, which is coming out of the public purse. So it's a tricky one, to be honest. But I do think the ICO and the Commissioner in Ireland has the control of those funds. But I can certainly look into more depth about but about how that might be distributed. But I don't believe that it would be seen as a means to compensate for the money that's being spent at the moment.
So your next area is looking at the exposure and the risk, and you're going to have a look here at some of the common crime definitions and the link between cybercrime and GDPR.
Yeah, they're very important at this point that to make no assumptions in terms of some phrases that I might start to use in the next few slides. So I just want to very quickly go through some basic crime definitions. So phishing is the most commonly spoken about, and that's examples that emails might go into your inbox, whether at home or at work, fraudulently attempting to get information out of you or for you to sign up to, to click something you shouldn't click. It also happens quite a lot through text and SMS. And then another one, which is whale phishing, which is becoming more common, which is masquerading as a senior player in an organization. It's also known as CEO fraud. So it's when you might receive an email that looks internal, and it might have come from your CEO, immediately kind of giving you the trust that it must be okay. And we're going to talk about trust in a bit more depth. So they're two common ones, and we'll talk about phishing stats in a moment. Malware obviously gets talked about a lot, and ransomware, as I've just been talking about with the NHS and health. So they're key to kind of have in mind when I do mention any kind of phraseology. We need to go back almost 30 years at this point to kind of talk about how all of this has come about, because it's nearly 30 years since the World Wide Web became publicly available. When it went live, people really didn't have any idea about the kind of impact of it and how it might be adopted globally. But even within 5 years, we were seeing the first phishing attack in 1996. In 2001, we were seeing sort of activities like post 9/11 ID checks, people trying to steal information on the back of a disaster level event. And year on year, cybercrime has escalated. And we got to that kind of early part of the 21st century when it was pretty obvious that, for example, in the UK, the Data Protection Act of 1998 was woefully out of date in respect of where we were. You had, lots of very public newsworthy stories about Facebook and how they were handling data. So, things had to change. It was a little bit of the Wild West. Now, why are accountants relevant to all of this? Well, basically, as the accountancy sector moves towards the adoption of technology and making life easier for its employees and its clients, it kind of at the same time increases its risk. So there's kind of four main areas really. There's the mobility and the fact that accountants are exploiting mobile technologies to be more productive and efficient, getting them closer to their clients and staying connected to them wherever they might be. Cloud adoption, huge subject for accountants in its own right. And I know that in the US, for instance, there's a lack of trust in cloud. They prefer to have their client data on premises. So it's very different to how we look at data in Europe and cloud. Social collaboration, massive conversations going on in accountancy about marketing and the fact that accountants maybe traditionally don't do marketing, and obviously social collaboration, social media is how they need to do that in the future and now. And then digital services. So about how accountants are using digital services and resources and accessing resources, self-service like portals for clients to access data or to sign documentation. So all of those kind of four areas are the evolution of accountancy, but they're also bringing the evolution of risk. So if you're kind of bringing this practice into your day-to-day accountancy function, but not focusing on data security, your risk is going through the roof. And you need to be thinking about the fact they go together hand in hand. You can't do one without the other.
So Richard, here's a question that we hear again and again and again. It's come in from Ramanit, and my apologies if the pronunciation of the name is incorrect. Are accountants data controllers or data processors? Like, this is the fundamental question. But like, accountants in general are data controllers. My understanding, and you'll correct me now if I'm wrong, accountants in general are data controllers because when they have the data, they have reporting responsibilities, criminal justice reporting responsibilities, money laundering reporting responsibilities, where they actually have responsibilities to report based on the data they hold. So they effectively are controllers.
Yeah.
But in some instances, they may just be processors. It does depend on the engagement. Can you speak to that? And the second part of Ramanit's question, do they need to register with the ICO or the Data Protection Office?
Yeah, but I'll answer the second question first. So yes, you need to register as a data controller with the ICO, and they will find organizations that don't. So that's it's very easy to do. There's a fee which depends on the size of your organization. So I'd recommend just visiting the ICO website and searching about registering as a data controller. The first question is one I hear a lot, and it's it can be quite a long answer. So it's basically every organization in some respect, as you've touched on then, Des, depending on the engagement, will be a data controller or a data processor or both. So for instance, if an accountant is offering payroll services for another organization, they're a data processor. The data that you're processing for your own clients would mean that you're a data controller. But you will also potentially have, so for instance, if you process the data, you might also be using a tool, a cloud-based payroll tool. That means you've got a sub-processor. It's a very broad conversation and a big subject. And people like the idea of thinking that they're going to be a controller or a processor. It's not that simple. It depends on the engagement, and there are also sub-processors and third parties to consider. And if you are using a third party to process data, you need a data processing agreement with each of them.
But the bottom line is the vast majority of accounting firms, bookkeeping firms, once they have external third-party reporting responsibilities, they fit into the category of data controllers. Now, Ramanit has just come back here with a question, the difference between data controllers versus data collectors. I won't even attempt to answer that one because I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, within the GDPR, it's data controller, data processor, and it's always best to stick to the terminology that within the legislation. If you're collecting data, essentially you're taking control of it. When you take control of data, you bring responsibilities on your shoulders that for compliance with the GDPR. I mean, what we can do, I don't know the best way to do it, Des, but whether we can answer those questions one by one after the event and go into more depth, then is that the best way to do that?
Well, do you want me to leave the questions, let you go through your presentation, and we answer all the questions at the end?
Well, yeah, I mean, depending how many there are, but it's,
well, there's only really one or two more.
Okay.
There's one that's particularly relevant now. Matthew raised this question very early in the session, and his question, it's about your third-party processors. Are cloud accounting software solutions responsible for GDPR? Like, my understanding is cloud accounting software solutions are responsible for GDPR and in their own right. The accountant is responsible for GDPR in their own right, but how the accountant interacts with the cloud accounting software and the cloud accounting software companies, that's really a key consideration. Like one of the big plays here is data is valuable. So most of the cloud accounting processors, they actually do say that they have elements of rights over the data that the accountants put in relation to their clients.
Yeah, so to kind of take it back to a blank canvas, really. So you've got an accountancy practice that might use various types of software tools from different providers, but let's go with practice management software. They engage the services of that practice software provider. So the accountant is the data controller, the software provider becomes the processor in that instance. Now, if there's a data breach with the practice management provider, the responsibility is on the accountant for that breach because they're the data controller. So the responsibility is on the practice management provider to liaise with the data controller and to support them through that process. The reason it's so important to have a data processing agreement is because if the breach has occurred through activities that you as the data controller weren't happy for them to engage in, or they did something in a different way, or the data wasn't where you said you wanted it to be, you then would have the opportunity and the right to regain maybe some of the financial damage that you suffer as a result of maybe a fine by the ICO or the commissioner in Ireland. So it's very important that with you use the services of a provider to process the data that you're ultimately responsible for, that you have agreements in place because they will be invaluable in the event of a data breach. but ultimately it's the data controller that is the entity that's fined by the supervising authority. For instance, if you have an accountant that's using CCH and there's a breach, Walters Clear have a breach, it's the accountant that suffers the fine. Yes, there would be implications to CCH in the grander scheme of things, but you're the data controller as the accountant, that you've chosen to engage those services of that provider, that third party. But it's probably a debate that you could have for kind of 40 minutes to an hour, really, because it's quite complex.
Okay, so home working. Obviously, people have been using smart working, remote working for a long time, but this, for some firms, is something brand new, COVID related.
It is, yeah, and so, you know, generally the rule of thumb that I go with, if you've got someone who's working at home for more than, or for 3 days of work or more, they're a home worker. If they're working at home a couple of days a week, it's not quite the same. It's an occasional home worker, but I thought it was really important to refer to this report from last year about future jobs and remote work, because the trend obviously is, you know, when you get to predictive trends, when you've got the luxury of not having an immediate threat like COVID-19, you can think about how things might evolve in the next few years. So the report from Future Jobs Ireland was talking about the fact that guidance is needed on how we do this, balancing data security and cyber security, and also information security, which relates to hard copy records as well. It's not all about computers and cyber security. So that people can work from home in a secure way, and if organizations allow or choose for their employees to work from home, that it's done in a secure manner. Now, obviously, the situation we've got at the moment, we had a global pandemic foisted upon us, which we didn't expect. And we've kind of thrown baby out with the bathwater a little bit when it comes to sending people home to work without all of these controls being in place. And the cyber security risk has gone through the ceiling, and cyber criminals are very entrepreneurial folk, and they immediately saw an opportunity to exploit that. So Reuters back in mid-March were talking about the fact that workers are moving their employers' data from professionally managed environments and corporate networks to home Wi-Fi setups protected with basic passwords. Now, and most often, in 99% of cases, those passwords will be the passwords that came out of the box with a Wi-Fi router. It should be changed immediately. People don't do that. People are working at home without any firewalls. Their antivirus may be expired if they've got it at all. And organizations, in trying to do the right thing, have massively increased their risk by people going to home to work in an insecure way in order to kind of just keep the business running as normal. So they're loosening restrictions, they're getting more flexible with where people work because they have to, but it's exposing the employers and the business, the employees and the business to lower tech threats, even through break-ins, etc. Because really, if you've got someone working from home on a routine basis, you should risk assess that environment for all kinds of aspects of security, even down to locks on windows and doors, burglar alarms. That all comes into a cybersecurity home working risk assessment. So we've kind of bypassed all of that and just sent people home. So there's a massive impact at the moment, and that's being felt globally. So accountants are exposed and they're at risk. So I'm going to talk about business continuity planning in a moment, but accountants are failing to plan adequately for business continuity, whether it's COVID-19 or it's a fire in the building, so they have to move all their staff elsewhere. COVID-19 has produced this perfect storm where all of this has been forced upon accountants. They've had to do it quickly. Home working's not been properly scoped or set up. And as I mentioned just now, everyone's working at home on insecure Wi-Fi. They haven't got antivirus, they haven't got firewalls. And most importantly, they probably haven't had any cybersecurity training. So only around about half of organizations provide regular cybersecurity or GDPR training for their staff. And as a result, we saw a massive spike even as early as mid-February, with phishing emails going up by 600%. And that's very deliberate. And when we get towards the end of the presentation, you'll see some quite stunning stats from Google to kind of emphasize those kind of numbers. So hopefully we'll get some questions about business continuity plans, because I'd like to know which organizations, A, have a business continuity plan in place, and B, more importantly, whether they actually test it to see if it works. So what is BCP? So it's the process of creating systems of prevention and recovery. So it's all about how you react to a threat to your organization, whether it's COVID-19 or fire, flood, snow, which stops you running your organization in its normal way, so that you can actually continue operations with a minimal impact on your clients or your customers. Every organization should have a BCP in place. It's not just for accountants, and it should be tested annually, and it should be robustly tested to make sure that it actually works, because when it comes to it, most often they don't. So what kind of things are we talking about? As I mentioned, natural disasters, fire, flood, pandemic, or data breaches or cyber attack. And once you kind of put your BCP together, you need to think about how those risks might impact on your operations, how to implement the safeguards and procedures, how to test it, and how to review. And being quite harsh, yes, COVID-19 is a serious global epidemic or pandemic that we could never have foreseen, but really it is just business continuity. It shouldn't be such a big shift for people to go home and work, and for suddenly for us to realize it's being done insecurely. It should be part of everyone's business continuity plan anyway. And obviously, it's a very painful way to learn, but I think BCPs will become more robust as a result of COVID-19. But
and we're seeing that in the front lines, Richard, for the last 5-6 weeks.
Yeah.
We're seeing the firms who are able to migrate to remote working and had the infrastructure, had the procedures, had the policies, and then we're seeing other firms that are struggling. They've done it, but it's a solution to keep the business open. But then we've also seen some accounting firms who literally, if they're not in the office, they can't work, and that's back to business continuity.
Yeah, absolutely, and as well, that's a lot to do with the culture within those organizations, and maybe the demographic of their staff, and I think all of this lends itself to millennials and Generation Z and how they prefer to work. And it may just, when we go back to those predictive trends in the future working report, I think this is just going to accelerate it, and it's just going to bring those things to fruition a lot faster than they may have naturally evolved. So, and I think that the millennials and the Gen Z mentality within the accountancy practice is going to be very important, to have those kind of individuals to make that work for practices. Why accountants need a BCP is quite obvious stuff, really. Continuity of service is critical to client trust and reassurance. If you have an impact, threat and disruption, it's going to obviously impact on your revenue and generate higher costs for you, which leads to a drop in profitability. And you can't rely on insurance, because it isn't going to cover all the costs that are involved. And even a temporary reduction in service, as you mentioned there, Des, with those firms that have struggled to adapt, is going to lead to that reputational damage and the migration of clients to other providers. So it's so important to have that seamless transition. And I know that the organizations that I worked in the past, we've tested our BCPs to the point where we'll announce today there is a disaster level event, you're going to have to go home to work. And until you test it, you just don't know if it works. So sometimes you can test it as what they call a tabletop test. So you just go through, what if we did this? Well, no, that wouldn't work. You can do it in theory, but it's much better to just to do it in practice. I love data, because data backs up arguments, basically. So why do we need it? Why do accountants need it? Human error, primary cause of all data breaches. So 70% of data breaches will be traced back to a human being. Only 52% in general of employees receive any kind of adequate GDPR training, and it should be annual. Put that into comparison with the fact that by next year, cyber crimes are costing global businesses €5.5 trillion. And then look at the fact that 40% or 46% of organizations don't believe their business continuity plan is up to scratch. So even though they don't think it's up to scratch, they still don't test it. So there are massive holes in business continuity, and that's something that if there's any takeaways from today, this should be one of the main takeaways, is that business continuity. We're learning on the job at the moment, unfortunately, but it didn't need to be that way. So some very quick next steps. So first step, really focus on a business impact analysis and determine those threats of disruption, what they might be. Identify what those disruptors might be. Obviously, this is a unique event, but it could be anything else. It could be those natural events like fire and flood that cause this. decide what's important for your accountancy practice and how you might be affected, how you maintain your IT infrastructure, for instance. All those things are absolutely critical. And then implement those procedures as quickly as possible, and make sure that your BCP is ready, because the next disaster level event might only be around the corner. We just don't know. That's the whole point, you know, is that it's a non-predictive environment. You okay with that, Des? Should we move on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to move on to, so the GDPR, very, very closely related to cybersecurity, although they're different subjects. I'm going to credit Nick Espinoza. He gave these 5 laws of cybersecurity out at a 7-minute TEDx talk in the States, and it really resonated with me, because I think he talked about the fact that he was a nerd to English translator, and I think that's very important, because it isn't a tech subject as such. This affects all of us, and we should as any human being or employee understand these threats. A simple fact before we go any further: there's just over 7.5 billion humans on Earth. 3.5 million of them are online. Most have no clue about the existence or the threat of cybercrime or data breaches, or the risk that they face when engaging online and giving away their personal data on a consistent basis day to day. So straight into the rules. Rule number 1, if there's a vulnerability, it will be exploited. So if you've got a vulnerability in your practice, it will be exploited at some stage, no exceptions. Hackers will attempt to hack anything. It's what they do. Review your accountancy practice, think about your IT infrastructure and any vulnerabilities, including the human beings. Because if there's a weakness, it will be exploited, and there are no exceptions to that. Rule number 2, everything is vulnerable in one way or another. So in the past, we might have been confident that we were secure, we were compliant, and that we couldn't be hacked. We can't have that view anymore. We must assume that everything is potentially able to be hacked, and that we will be attacked, and that we must prepare accordingly. So it's not a question of if we'll be attacked, or if your accountancy practice will be hacked or attacked by a cyber criminal or malicious threat actor, as they're referred to. You will be. It's just a question of when, and you just need to be ready to make sure that you can handle that when it happens. Rule number 3. Des and I had a chat about this subject before the webinar, and this is a huge subject. This is quite a deep subject, because it gets into the way that humans process and the way we are and what makes us different. Humans trust even when they shouldn't. Cybercrime relies completely on the fact that we trust what comes into our inbox, or what we see genuine, and the fact that it's safe to click, or it's that we've bought an out-of-the-box antivirus for £20 and it's going to be as strong as Fort Knox. It isn't going to be. We trust it is, because the box says it's going to be. So the strength and the uniqueness of human trust is also our greatest vulnerability. So one of the greatest challenges with cybersecurity is, how do we affect that, and how do we change the fact that human beings are generally non-cynical and trusting, and we take things at face value. So that's a huge subject. That's rule number 3. Rule number 4, with innovation comes the opportunity for exploitation. A great example of this is in doctors' surgeries, where you go in and you now may be presented with a tablet to sign your name, your date of birth. You've got someone like me standing behind you, shoulder surfing, and I'm basically gathering all of your personal data. And then you go to the reception desk and they ask for your home address. So quite quickly, the innovation of making the sign-in process quick and easy has actually increased the cyber risk. And that's across the world. That's across all environments. Our more connected lifestyle has made our lives more convenient, but it's come with what I call a dark +1, which is the risk of cybercrime has increased. So it's come with its dark friend, basically. And that's something we need to be incredibly focused on, especially in accountancy, where technology and adoption is being forced upon your sector so heavily, and security is not always in the mind of the providers of the software that you're being sold to by. So that's not their greatest priority. Their priority is to sell to you. The onus of responsibility for security is on you as Europe. Rule number 5, when in doubt, refer back to rule 1. If your accountancy practice has a vulnerability, it will be exploited. That's the main takeaway from the 5 rules.
Like going all the way back to May 2018, Richard, you know, we were saying to accountants, it's not a question of, oh, you know, if will I be breached? It's a question of when you will be breached.
There you go. Next slide.
Sorry.
Yeah, so there's 2 types of organization. It used to be, we used to talk about the fact that there are those that have suffered a cyber attack and those that haven't yet. Now it's those that have suffered a cyber attack and those that don't know they have. And one of the reasons that's important to note is because so many cyber attacks, especially the mining attacks which go on in large organizations, the really good ones will be really subtle. So you won't know about them until you feel the pain. That pain might be 18 months later when you've discovered that someone's been in your system for the last 2 years, very subtly taking information from you. That it's only the aggressive immediate attacks that kind of flag themselves very quickly. So the idea that you've not suffered a cyber attack just can't be something you can say with any confidence anymore. And to be honest, I'd go a step further and say there's no such thing as GDPR compliance, because it's a very fluid state. You're only compliant in the moment. In the next 5 minutes, one of your employees might make a mistake that causes a data breach. You can no longer say that you are. So it's a very fluid state, and it demands constant attention and constant focus and a constant investment in taking the subject seriously.
Excellent. I love this title on your slide, Richard. The Human Firewall.
Yes, yeah, it does kind of lend itself to an image of people lining up, linking hands outside your business, but yeah, it's not quite that. But it's a commonly used phrase actually. So I'm not going to take credit for the phrase, but what it is the commitment of a group of employees or a team within your accountancy practice to follow best practice and report data breaches or suspicious activity. So they're kind of your team on the ground that is kind of working on increasing and embedding that culture of cybersecurity into your business. Makes perfect sense that the more people that are involved in that, the stronger it is. And it relies on two elements. It relies on the knowledge of the importance of cybersecurity, and it also relies on the fact that people know how to act upon it. And empowerment is very important within this, to empower employees to put their hands up and say, look, is this a data breach? Even if they're not 100% sure it is, because it's always best to kind of check. So really what you need to, in order to do that, is to form a team of key individuals within your practice, potentially led by your data protection officer if you have one, or your nominated individual who looks after data security for you. And there are 7 elements to creating it, which I'll come to in a couple of slides' time. Why do accountancy practices need firewall, human firewall? Well, your employees represent your greatest risk. Inside threat actors account for 25 to 40% of all data breaches worldwide. So that's the kind of accidental releasing of data or responding to a phishing email that they shouldn't. And then if we add in lost or stolen mobile devices, which accounts for 30%, that takes you up to 70% of all breaches are due to human error. So it makes perfect sense. And this doesn't always happen, because if an organization is worried about data security and they reach out into the world of Google and they start looking for some support and help, most often they'll be faced with an organization trying to sell them software or sell them a tech solution, which is absolutely fine because it does add value, and there's no doubt. But the key, actually, when you look at those kind of statistics and those percentages, it's your people and your human beings and your employees that you need to educate and work with. That's where you're going to get the most immediate, fast impact in terms of reducing your risk, is awareness. That's why you need to create a human firewall and evolve that culture. Here's an example which is in the public domain. Now, I am going to say from the outset, this event was pre-GDPR. Had it been 6 months later or 9 months later, this would have been quite a dramatic story within the UK GDPR environment. So Old Mill, which is an accountancy firm in the west of England, uploaded a mailing list containing nearly 7,500 names of addresses of farmers. They were involved in badger culling. So although it wasn't publicly visible, it could be seen and downloaded quite easily via Google search. And it involved names, salutations, company names and addresses of people. And it ended up in the hands of animal rights activists. So when you consider in the GDPR about a serious breach, and the fact that if it relates to threat to the rights and freedoms of the individuals, and this could potentially have been a cause of harm or threat of harm, even a threat of life. This was a really serious example and a great case study of what can go wrong. Interestingly enough, I gave a talk at the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Yeovil a couple of months ago, and one of their competitor firms was asking me if I knew whether there was going to be some action taken about this. So the sector knows about it, and you know, they're not alone, but it's a really good example of how these things can happen by accident. I'll very quickly go through the 7 elements of the human firewall.
Just in terms of the 7 elements,
yes.
Richard, let's loop back to where we started, because actually this is right where we started in terms of culture.
Yes.
Like the human firewall, and you've now broken it down to 7 elements, but this is a cultural part. We can have all the policies and procedures. We can have a privacy notice. We can have GDPR procedures. We can do reviews. We can do whatever we want. But this is a cultural piece.
Yeah, this is about embedding cybersecurity and the GDPR into the very DNA of your organization. It's about making sure that it's something that's at the foremost part of your mind in every aspect of your operation. It should be a board level item at every board meeting. Data security should be discussed. These guys in the human firewall team should be represented at board level. So it's I'll whiz through them relatively quickly, and I'll focus mainly on the headings.
One thing, folks, there's questions in here. We are seeing the questions. As Richard said at the very outset, he has a significant amount of material. So what we're going to do is we're going to let Richard finish his slides. So anybody that just wants the core material, they can then get off. But anybody who has questions, Richard and myself will stay on here. We will answer all questions at the end of this session. So if you have questions, I'm not ignoring you. We will come to your questions, but we just let Richard finish his slides, and then we'll go into the Q&As.
Yeah.
So the 7 elements of the human firewall, Richard.
Yep, so we'll get through the 7 elements, and then we'll talk about COVID-19 specifically with cybersecurity. So very obvious, make it easy. Don't make it something that people can't do. Yes, you need 30 to 35 GDPR policies as a rule, but when it comes to the actual tangible day-to-day activity, make it easy to consume, bite-sized chunks. Keep that education going so that people are receiving updates and keeping their knowledge fresh. That's really essential. Incentivize commitment. It's very important to reward people for flagging suspicious activity, even if it's not. When you look at the fact that an organization has 72 hours from discovery of a breach to report it, that's a very, very narrow window. You don't want employees or anyone in your business mulling over whether they should report something for 24 hours or 36 hours or waiting till Monday morning if it happened on Friday. Incentivize the fact they flag it up. Include all departments. This is not a tech subject. This is not an IT subject. This is across all aspects of your business, frontline in particular. Keep it human. Very important that it's a cultural thing like we've talked about, and it's in your DNA. And monitor the level of vigilance to make sure that the individual who, for instance, coming into their boxes understand how to recognize a phishing email, and you can use simulations of phishing to test, and that's a really good way of doing things. Is basically to test the whole organization with a fake phishing email that you set up and see how many people click. If they do, you can go and have a chat to them in private and say, look, this was, you really shouldn't have done that. We need to focus on some more training and be constantly evolving. That's the key. Cyber criminals are evolving daily. This needs to evolve with it. And I think that once we start to see GDPR fines, there'll be much more emphasis on that, and it'll be a much easier sell. So that's the 7 elements. Very brief, unfortunately. I'm afraid to sorry to rush through that. But this is the core kind of subject. COVID-19 and cybercrime. I'm referring to it as the other pandemic. Some really scary stats. So last week, April 17th, Google announced that it was seeing 18 million daily scam emails related to COVID-19 from the week commencing the 6th of April. So a huge number. So that's basically going back to those criminal definitions that I referred to. It's mostly malware and phishing emails intended to defraud. And it's also reporting 240 million COVID-related daily spam messages. But quite confident that its inbuilt algorithms were screening this out. But it's the intent, it's the intent that the effort and the ingenuity that goes into setting this stuff up is just astounding, really. And then a fantastic group, the COVID-19 Cyber Threat Coalition. You can find them online on Twitter at Threat Coalition. Brilliant group. They picked up that criminal groups and nation state actors, which I've underlined for a reason, are exploiting COVID-19 to target healthcare systems and critical IT infrastructures. So there's a lot of talk in the news generally about nation states using cybercrime and hacking to attack each other. It's the new form of warfare. But even in this kind of global situation where everyone's in the same boat, nation states are still taking advantage of cybercrime to attack each other and to exploit each other. They reported that hundreds of thousands of fake domains were set up in mid-February to mid-March in relation to COVID-19, around about 5,000 domains every day. It's easy to set up a domain on a website. If you ask me to do it, to set up a fake website today, I could set up a very, very good looking, genuine website within the day with a great domain. It's not difficult. These guys are just on another level. They can do stuff incredibly well. They're impersonating the World Health Organization. They're impersonating nation states. You're getting emails which look incredibly genuine. You wouldn't think for a second that they're fake, but you should always have that air of caution and always check. One of the things they're sending out, well, they're basically luring, so they're what we call lures. So they're sending out fact sheets about COVID-19, medical supplies, PPE offers, personal protective equipment, huge subject in the UK about the shortage. So if they're targeting healthcare providers and offering them PPE for sale, they're going to be driven to kind of click and go for that. Testing kits, charity donations, working from home tools or software, vaccinations or cures, or even an alert that you've come into contact with a COVID-19 patient. This is the sort of stuff that's being sent out from very genuine domains that make you feel that you need to act upon it and respond. Taking everything into account that I've talked about, I've got 2 more slides and a kind of a summary really. So I think what we're looking at as a result of COVID-19 is a permanent change for accountancy in the way that accountants work. It could be that the old school practice may be too dependent on physical office process to succeed in this new environment. And you need softer skills to express yourself successfully over video or on a daily basis, as opposed to the occasional webinar.
Let's be honest, it's hard. It's hard managing a virtual team. It's different. It's a whole different style of. It's much easier to go out and walk around the office and say, okay, what's that person doing? And what's that person doing? And what's that person doing?
Yeah.
It's harder to live through Zoom, to live through Microsoft Teams. It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, culturally, if you imagine someone who lives on their own, they go into work. That is their kind of social interaction. If you're forcing those people to work from home on their own, the morale element of it, the human resource element of it, the fact that remote working isn't everyone's cup of tea, but Gen Z, that kind of age group, which maybe 20 at the moment, they're going to be the most comfortable with this. They've been brought up on video conferencing software and social media. If you fast forward maybe 8 or 10 years, these are going to be sort of 32-year-olds who are going to start to reside in senior roles in organized. They're going to drive this, and they're going to be far more comfortable with this way of working than traditional people like myself, 48. So practices need to evolve really quickly, and even tracking performance and making sure that people are actually working. So it's going to be very difficult, and the adoption is going to need to be very quick, because I don't personally feel that it's going to be a very smooth change back to working 5 days a week in the office. I don't think we're going to see that at all. I don't see that in the next 12 months. So the change is going to be quite dramatic. And it'll also impact on an accountancy cybersecurity revolution in terms of how you are responsible for your employees working at home. It's okay to go home and work as part of a business continuity plan, and for ultimately not to be exactly perfect. When you're basically asking people to work at home on a consistent basis, maybe 2 or 3 days every week, that's entirely different. And you then will need to assume responsibility for that office environment as if it was within your building. So these are the kind of things that we're facing. And there is going to be a massive drive. People have visibly seen a change in the environment around them as a result of people not traveling to work. So I think that the pressure is going to be on every sector. accountants in particular, I think, are going to need to evolve quite quickly. But you definitely need to take ownership of your employees' home working space and infrastructure. And the critical question at the minute is are you able to do that? Do you have those business continuity functions in place? Do you have that human firewall? Have you got that focus on the GDPR?
And again, Richard, we have to go all the way back to where we started in this webinar.
Yep.
There are some accountancy firms out there who were fully cybersecurity enabled, have put the energy and effort into GDPR compliance.
Yep.
Then there are the firms that kind of have the tick box compliance and wouldn't be fully cyber secure, but have cyber or have cloud and remote capabilities. And then there are the firms that they really haven't complied with GDPR and don't have the IT capabilities. Yeah. But everybody at the three levels has to go back and review and assess their situation. And obviously the people who have the lower levels of compliance pre-COVID, the lower levels of IT and remote capabilities, they've got more work to do. The people in the middle have more work to do. But everybody has work to do here, folks. And this is like, I don't know. I'm not going to say to you, well, okay, you need to go do this now. We're in the eye of a storm. The first wave has come, the shock and awe. Now we've had the issues around subsidy schemes and furloughing and laying people off and availing of government schemes. And all through this, you've got to protect your clients, protect the business, protect yourselves, protect your family. But somewhere in this process, GDPR has to come back in onto your horizon. And Richard, you know, one of the things I've really taken, and this is, any of you who are Profit Pro members have heard me talking about the digital subscription model firm and how business is going to change after COVID-19. This is another fundamental building block in what our firms need to look like, do, be capable of when we come out the far side of this crisis. Yeah. Richard, thank you very much. That was absolutely excellent. I'm just going to go in here to some of the questions, right? So we're just coming up on 10 past. So we'll answer off some of the questions here. So Colin, how are you keeping, Colin? How bad a breach, Richard, would you consider when somebody sends an email to multiple people showing all addresses rather than via a BCC? Like, so do you know when you get in those emails and sort of everybody is named and you can see all the email addresses, how would you rank that in terms of seriousness of a breach?
I've lived through a breach like that. So previous organization, I was the data protection officer, and a report was sent out that contained first name, second name, and email addresses of a range of clients. It was only intended for one of the clients, and it was 165 data subjects that were affected. So the key thing to think about, and I'm not sure if the Data Protection Commission Ireland has this on their website, but the ICO in the UK does. It has a really good basic tool to help you decide whether you should report that breach, because not every breach needs to be reported. But you need to consider the rights and freedoms of the individuals affected. So yes, it is a data breach. Do you have to report it? Probably no, because you have to assess those rights and freedoms of the individuals and what damage has been done to them. If you start adding in things like home addresses, that becomes a little bit different. But I've lived through that breach.
Realistically, Richard, half the world knows my email address. Now, most accountants would say, we wish we didn't know your email address because we're getting emails from you all the time. But and you can find it on our website. They can find it on your website. So if I in error sent an email to a whole lot of people and they were all people like us whose email addresses are publicly available, that's obviously way down the scale in terms of impact on the individuals versus like losing bank statements or pay slips, or maybe even like, and I've seen this several times, I just delete the emails now. I don't even look at them. I delete them. and I email back to the accountant saying, I think I got that one in error. Because oftentimes I see accountants where they're CCing client information, and I end up, maybe there's a Derek in the organization and they go to hit Derek, but they end up hitting Des. And I get an email. Like the CC as opposed to the BCC, if it's just email addresses, it's not as big an issue. But if there was a set of client accounts sent to somebody incorrectly, that's obviously much more fundamental, isn't it?
Yeah, but I guess the thing to focus on is maybe not the impact, but the cause, because the cause is the impact is basically obviously what's happened and where it's gone and what's involved. But if it's happened once, it will happen again, and potentially next time is the occasion when a really sensitive document's attached. So that's the key really, is to eradicate the activity. It needs to go into your breach reporting log anyway, even if you don't report it to the supervising authority. And it's about what you're describing is the most common data breach, is the email going to the person it's not intended to go to. So the action, you can say, well, it's gone there, there's no harm done, but the next time there might be a really sensitive document attached. So it's all about assessing the impact, what's involved. That will always happen. We've all done it. We all do it. But it's just about taking that extra bit of care, really. But like I said, having lived through that breach, the impact is more of a ripple effect, and it's more about what are they thinking about my organization? Are they thinking that we're careless with personal data now? Does that impact on how they view our practice? Do they think they can trust us as much with personal data as they did maybe a few hours ago? That's the kind of stuff that I'm thinking of as a DPO. Is how can I reduce that avoid it from happening again? Because when you start to layer those events up and there's 3 or 4 like that, you start to see a pattern and say, well, hang on, this organization is quite careless, and it's only a matter of time before something they send out is sensitive and does cause quite a bit of damage.
Richard, there's a question in here. We have to be very, very careful. I'm going to ask the question as it has been asked. And you will understand in a second why we can't really answer it, because if we answer it in a certain way, we could be sued for defamation. So there's a question here: which is safer to use while communicating with your colleagues while working remotely? WhatsApp or Microsoft Teams, or is there a safer app to use? Now, it's a really valid question practically, but I don't want to give the politician's answer, which is really no answer, Richard.
No.
So I'm going to give my answer on this, then I get your thoughts. We obviously can't come out and say, oh, WhatsApp is compliant and this Microsoft is not, or we can't do that. But no. You have to assess based on the data usage and privacy, and you have to exercise an element of common sense.
Yeah.
And if a company, a global company, who is in the eyes of data commissioners all over the world, they probably have to be compliant. But what's your practical advice to people when choosing communication apps?
Well, it's you have to think beyond the GDPR on this one, because in the UK, so for instance, I was working with a healthcare organisation that their employees were using Messenger informally to arrange shift swaps and cover holiday and that kind of stuff. But there were instances where a little bit of bullying going on within the organisation. Now, even though the organisation wasn't aware that these employees had set the platform up informally, they're vicariously liable for any of the bullying that goes on in the workplace. So it's basically still seen as a workplace platform. So what we try to do with that organisation is to help them to bring that in-house through using Microsoft Teams. It's not about kind of preferential treatment or views of particular organizations' products, but for business use, I would highly recommend using something like Teams over anything like WhatsApp or Messenger, definitely. Mainly because you've got the visibility and you can also distance yourself from the informal use of other platforms that every platform and every service will come under scrutiny for its levels of security at some stage. Organizations, massive global organizations spend millions of pounds on cybersecurity and still get hacked. That's a fact. So it's just about, you know, going back to those 5 rules of cybersecurity, does about the fact that everything is vulnerable in its own way. So it's just about choosing the right tool that suits your organization, but think about the access of it as well. So if you think about the fact that people could use WhatsApp at home or Messenger at home, you might want to restrict the control of Teams, and you've got obviously 2-factor and multi-factor authentication as well to bring into this. So personally, I would prefer something like Teams. It's kind of a more formal way of, it's just more suited to business, especially accountants. You know, we're talking about accountants here, so I would recommend that. And it also brings with it other side of that where you can restrict channels. So it's yeah. Hopefully that kind of isn't too political an answer.
We're going to give two or three more questions because we are coming up nearly on 90 minutes. Here's a classic question in from Natalie that I think a lot of people on the call with us today, on the webinar, on the live stream have. The team were provided with laptops that directly link to the office without any other applications. But they haven't necessarily confirmed the home Wi-Fi passwords have changed. Are we exposed, and can we insist on these changes? I suppose I'm going to give a very practical answer to that. This is part of what the business continuity planning, and this is part of what COVID has pushed into the domain, because now this isn't necessarily a GDPR thing. This is actually an operational procedure within your firm.
Yep.
And having a checklist for, okay, home working, you got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this. How exposed on a scale of 1 to 10 is somebody like Natalie if they've done the right thing, they've gone to the IT provider, they're working off devices, it's part of the integrated security environment, but they've omitted that small issue?
Well, home Wi-Fi is extremely vulnerable to hacking. We can talk about things like wall chalking. I don't know, WAR. So that's basically scenarios where you could drive around the streets of, most common in cities rather than small towns, where at 3 in the morning you'll see people parked up in cars in residential streets on laptops. They basically hacking your home Wi-Fi because the passwords are so easy to guess, and they're still out of the box passwords. If you turn it around, why would an organization send somebody home with ticking 90% of boxes in terms of the kit they've given them and the access to the company infrastructure, and then not check that their Wi-Fi is secure? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I think that it is operational. So your home working policy should definitely have those kinds of risk assessments built in. Your data protection officer or someone responsible within the organization should do a physical home visit. This is what we're talking about with the fact that we've so quickly, essentially people shouldn't be working from home on a consistent basis unless that environment has been fully risk assessed and signed off. So the home Wi-Fi is definitely an area of weakness.
And you see, this is what today's webinar is about, folks. Look, we didn't come out when the shutdown happened at the end of March and say GDPR is the thing you need to be focusing on. So everybody appreciates we needed to do what we needed to do. But my concern is, as this progresses, things like GDPR and cybersecurity are coming up the rank in terms of importance and considerations as we deal with the frontline crisis issues. And what we're trying to do today is to highlight these points that you're raising. A question in here from Howard, another practical question. You know, I remember when GDPR came in first, Richard, and there was a lot of people saying emails from accountants have to be encrypted. They have to be encrypted. And the encryption companies and some of the cyber companies sold huge amounts of encryption. I'm fairly okay on IT. Now, our IT service providers might disagree with that, based on the number of support calls I make, but I'm fairly okay with IT. But I remember getting emails from accountants that were encrypted. And eventually I had to, because you click on the email, the password wouldn't work, there'd be some problem with this, you wouldn't be able to get, and I'd ring them up and say, can you just send me the thing? And what I've seen was there was a significant amount of encryption at the start of GDPR by the people who were really taking this seriously. But it seems to have dropped off now. Like clients are basically saying to accountants, stop sending me that shit, just give me what I need.
Yeah, well it's an interesting one, because I've seen this pattern personally, where the client so the accountant is trying to look after the interests of the client in terms of personal data by using encryption or using VPN or a secure tunnel to send that information to them. But the client may not necessarily have any interest or knowledge of cybersecurity and just doesn't understand or care about the risk. So they've pushed back on it. Now, the unfortunate aspect of that is the responsibility still lies with the accountant to make sure they do it securely. So you're kind of caught between two stools there. But not every email needs to be encrypted. Just think about the GDPR and the information that you might be sending. That should determine whether you send it in a more secure format than a standard email. So if you send, and also think about using portals more maybe than sort of constantly encrypted emails. If someone's got access to a portal or a client's got access to a portal,
The recommendation that we got from an IT firm 2 years ago, they said, look, you're asking the wrong question. It's not about email encryption. Email is not secure. We need to be looking at portals. We need to be looking at more, they're just saying that emails are so easily hackable, no matter what security level you have. And there's a great question in here from Stephen. How would we know we've been hacked? Are there obvious signs to look out for? Well, Stephen, if you're a particularly IT literate accountant and you're running your own IT, maybe. But for the most part, Richard, is it overly simplistic that the quality of your IT very much comes down to the quality of your IT provider?
Yeah, so I recommend this might be a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think what I recommend initially is that accountancy firms 100% make sure they've got monthly at least vulnerability scanning or penetration testing of your network, just to see how secure you are. Because rather than kind of chasing individual rabbits that are running around your garden, just try and make your fence more secure in the first place. So once you kind of ask the question, how would we know if we've had an attack? You've kind of gone too far with your kind of self-questioning, looking at your defenses in the first instance. And the best way to test how good they are is to have regular monthly vulnerability scans, which can be as little as £10 a month. Penetration tests are a little bit more, and they're a little bit more in depth. But a good reputable IT provider can do that for you very, very quickly. Set that up. They look after it and make sure that it's done every month. They'll give you a report, and it can give you some level of confidence about how secure your network is. But going back to something I mentioned earlier, that the most subtle and successful hacks are the ones which you don't notice. Again, that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but it's just to be vigilant, really. It very much depends on the size of the firm. Some firms will have in-house IT, some firms will have external IT. It's just, I would just recommend having that business continuity review, carry out a business impact assessment, and just look at where you are now. I'd be more than happy to talk to people about the next steps, but it really does depend on where you are now and how confident you are in your infrastructure at the moment. That's kind of the best answer for that one.
And a related second last question, like most accountants in from Howard, we rely heavily on our IT third-party service provider, making sure we have adequate security. There's not an IT provider in the world that says, oh, I do your IT, but it won't be secure, right? So straight away, there's a little bit of a compromise. And Howard's question is, should we be getting a report from them on a regular basis at cybersecurity attempts and circumventions? What would you recommend there, Richard?
100%. An organization I work with quite closely in my part of the world, they'll give you that report. So the evolving IT firms are very much getting now into cybersecurity. They're not just coming in and installing your computers or sending you laptops. So yes, they should be doing that. But you should also, as a first port of call after today's webinar, make sure that you've got a contract in place with your IT provider, because that's a big part of cybersecurity and the GDPR, is to make sure that you do have a contract in place with accountability. So your IT provider shouldn't just be taking your money every month and then wash their hands of an event that they should have foreseen or prevented. So get a contract in place with your IT provider as soon as possible if you haven't got one. And if they're reluctant to do that, then you need to go to somebody else.
An observation, Padraig, the very last one. Padraig, I've encountered a lack of awareness around some cloud accounting providers about the need to offer data processor agreements. In one case, I was told I was the only person who'd asked for this. Now, funnily enough, Padraig, depending on the company it is, they probably tell everybody that they were the only person who asked for it. And this is an issue, like data processor agreements. Some of the IT companies, big and small, and the providers and the software providers, they won't sign the agreement that the accountant wants to put in place. They don't necessarily always have agreements themselves, and they're very lax on this, kind of going, oh, well, look, you know, it's not us. What's your guidance to Padraig on that? That he needs to stand his ground and get clarity, and either it's in the terms that are signed. Like some IT providers, basically, when you'd ask them about, well, what are you, a controller or a processor? They didn't even understand the difference between controllers and processors. And then they'd say, oh, that's covered in an agreement. And I was going, well, we never signed it. And they said, oh, well, it's wrapped up in, and then the conversation just trails off and disappears.
Yeah. I mean, going back 2 years, or 2.5 years ago, my early interpretations of data processor agreements were that the onus was entirely on the data controller to make sure that those DPAs are in place. I still feel that way quite strongly, but there are benefits for the data processor to have it in place as well. But it would be very rare for the data processor to approach the data controller and push a data processing agreement in front of them that they should sign, because there's definitely a benefit to the data processor if there's a little bit of a gray area. So because you're the data controller as an accountant, you're the entity that's going to get fined. It's in your interest to make sure that all of your data, third-party data processors, have signed a DPA that you've written, not that they've written, that you've written and created, to explain how you want that data processed, where you want it to reside, and how it should be processed. So the onus is definitely on you. If you've got a large, like a large provider, they may not necessarily have a bespoke agreement that they have with each individual customer, but they may have a DPA on their website which accounts for all of their customers and is generic. So that's the first kind of question: is how big is this provider? Have they got a generic DPA on their website which applies to everybody, or are they a little bit smaller, and would you have a direct bespoke DPA with them? But as the accountant, I'd definitely be pursuing that. If they're reluctant to sign a data processing agreement, again, similar to one of my previous answers, I'd be looking to go elsewhere.
Richard, thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks, Des.
I made 2.5 pages of notes as a co-facilitator, so I've learned a huge amount of this. That's always a good sign of a webinar when I'm taking that amount of notes. Folks, Richard, pulsecyber.co.uk is where you will find Richard. He has come from a background of accountants. He works with accountants. He knows accountants. I think you can see from today's webinar, he knows and understands the issues that you guys are facing. So anybody wants GDPR help or assistance, check out pulsecyber.co.uk.
Thanks, Des.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All of you joining us here live, whether you're on the webinar, whether you're on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, wherever we're streaming, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found today's session beneficial. If you're not already a member, check out our Irish Accountants for Growth Facebook group, Profit Pro. The UK, we have a Accountants for Growth UK dedicated Facebook group. You'll find us in there, and our COVID-19 series will continue as accountants continue the frontline battle to protect the livelihoods and businesses of UK and Ireland. So thank you very much. Keep safe. We're in this together, and until I see you again, let's get it done.